Hello, my name is Emily Hunter, and I'll be presenting today my Global Youth Study Report on youth and the climate crisis, what I'm calling Youth in a Warming World. For most of this presentation, you won't see me, but you'll get to hear me and see my slides. So here goes. I want to start with a quote by Sarah Jacket Ray, and that's, "The trauma of being young in this historical moment will shape this generation in many ways. The rest of us have a lot to learn from them, and we would do well to help them see that their grief and despair are the other side of love and connection, and help them channel that towards effective action. For their sake and that of the planet, we need them to feel empowered to shape and desire their future. They have superpowers unique to their generation. They are my antidote to despair." And on that note, that is very much the focus of my presentation here today and the report, as I'm looking at not only youth and climate change, but also their mental health. So I wanted to ask two questions in this report. How is exposure to the climate crisis, real or imagined, affecting young people in terms of their emotional and physical well-being? And what can they teach us in their emotional resolve to the crisis? Now, I took a very divergent approach here in terms of tackling the climate change debate. For instead of looking at it as a sort of a masculine approach, if you will, as it's predominantly a debate that's being covered in the sciences, in the political realm, economic realm, and even a security framework apparatus. Instead, I'm looking at it from a feminist perspective around justice, equity, and health. Specifically, I'm looking at the story of intergenerational injustice to youth from the climate crisis from a physical and mental health well-being standpoint, in order to explore alternative solutions around the climate crisis and alternative knowledge around the climate crisis. So moving forward now, I'm going to go look at now what youth are up against, and that is very much the crisis as it is unfolding for Generation Z. Generation Z being, of course, those born in mid-1990s to 2010, and being the largest generation to have ever existed, about 1/3 of the population now, and who are very much in many ways facing the brunt of the climate crisis, as they will face the majority of the consequences, some of the harshest consequences in their lifetime, and who are some of the least responsible for it. In terms of these consequences, there is both direct and indirect experiences in the physical well-being front. For 80% of illnesses and injuries and deaths from the climate crisis will affect children and youth, according to WHO. And these direct impacts look like extreme natural disasters, typhoons, hurricanes, floods, droughts, but also the spread of environmental toxins and infectious diseases. It's also looking at the indirect impacts from those disasters, such as food shortages, conflict and war, mass migration, economic downturn, and fallouts. They're also up against mental health. In anyone who's experienced those extreme natural disasters, they may have experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And this can take the form of depression, panic attacks, sleep and anxiety disorder, cognitive deficits, learning problems, and impaired language development. But there's a lesser known mental health issue that's only starting to emerge with new research, which is for youth that haven't experienced a natural disaster or will have limited contact with natural disasters, particularly youth in the global north, let's say, that they would still experience a kind of PTSD, but it's now a pre-traumatic stress disorder that's of this kind of sense of looming threat and stress from an impending doom, an ecological doom. And this also takes the shape of similar symptoms in terms of depression, panic attacks, but also insomnia and obsessive thinking, and even substance use disorders. In fact, in the most recent Lancet report on climate anxiety in young people, it says the stress of a climate crisis during a crucial development period, coupled with an increased likelihood of encountering repeated stressors related to climate change through life, will conceivably increase the incidence of mental illness over their life course. This is the reason why some are calling it a structural violence and an intergenerational injustice to youth, for this exact reasons, but also due to the long-term developmental and educational challenges they will experience from this stress, that will limit their ability to meet their full potential in their lifetime. And yet this is all happening in a time when we absolutely need their full potential if we are to meet our massive decarbonization agenda in this decade. So that brings me to the model that I wanted to frame this conversation in, because if we're going to look at how youth are responding to the climate crisis from an emotive and psychological sense, I found it best to kind of categorize it as 5 stages of climate grief. Now, this is built off the Kubler-Ross model, which is better known as the 5 stages of grief model. And this is based on a 1969 book called On Death and Dying by a Swedish American psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, while this is a very popularized model, it has also been a criticized model, as obviously not all experiences of grief and loss can be so simplistically categorized into 5 stages. However, even Kubler-Ross herself would say that it wasn't meant to be so rigidly and linear understanding of the model. Instead, there was artificial categorization in order to express a journey of emotions that people were having through loss and despair and grief. And so with that context, I still found this a useful model to describe the diverse and wide-ranging experiences of youth in grappling with the climate crisis, as also using an artificial categorization of 5 stages to express kind of a journey and a narrative of what youth are going through right now. So I have taken liberties with this model, calling it what I'm naming it here, the 5 stages of climate grief. And I have taken liberties knowing that there is a diverse set of a range of emotions and experiences of youth, and that they will be outside of what I'm proposing here, absolutely. But for the purposes of this report, I'm describing it here as the first stage being shock and denial, particularly with climate denialism. The second one being anxiety and pain. I've added this stage in terms of the emerging research on eco-anxiety and climate distress. And then I lumped anger and bargaining together in terms of looking at the youth climate movement. Then also depression and reflection in terms of experiences of activist burnout and kind of a collective depression and reflection with COVID-19. And then lastly, instead of the known acceptance stage, I've replaced that with reconstructing and resilient stage, with lessons learned from the most impacted and marginalized peoples, particularly in this case, BIPOC youth, and lessons from critical environmental justice. So here we go. So with each stage, I wanted to share a quote from you, from a young person experiencing these various stages of emotions and psychological experiences of the climate crisis. And this first one is from Jamie Margolin, who is the co-executive director of 0 Hour and the plaintiff with Our Children's Trust. And she expresses the shock and denial stage as: the longer you live in a world that sees you as just another cog in the machine, the more your eyes glaze over the injustices in front of you and the less you question, creating a sense of denialism. Now we see this kind of shock and denial era and tactics play out for sure in Trumpism. But what is it? So climate denialism is this kind of wholesale rejection of the idea of the science, and that the Earth's climate is changing, and that weather patterns are changing, and that this is even human induced. And in fact, say none of this is happening. Now, it's perhaps no shock that the highest climate denial demographic tends to be conservative white males, according to a US study in 2011, and that researchers attribute in part of this desire is to maintain a status quo that disproportionately benefits them. Now, I would argue it's not just a political power struggle that is ensuring the sense of denialism, but it's also very much in the education that we have. Whether you're even getting an environmental education at all can create a sense of denialism. But if you even are, in fact, environmental education has been criticized for internalizing neoliberalism, particularly in how it delivers the education around engagement and solutions. That often it's sort of pacifying youth by saying that all we need to do is do these individual lifestyle choices rather than collective action, rather than political engagement, which is sort of this collective amnesia, collective denial of the scale of the problem that's required around systems change. If we can just recycle our way out of it, we can still be a good consumer versus wholesale across sector, across industry levels of change that climate change is demanding of us. So that has created a sense of denial. I'd also argue that this power struggle and this internalized neoliberalism in our education system has ultimately created an internalized anxiety over the changing world. And by not necessarily recognizing the changes that need to happen, but stressed about the world, this can play out in violent and disturbing ways, from Trumpism, populism, far-right extremism, terrorism, and uptake in white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. For example, with the Proud Boys, they're absolutely linked to this idea of the pastoral nature, pastoral past, and that is very much linked to this settler colonial gaze of nature. And so in a changing world, both power struggle and even with the climactic changes, Proud Boys very much reflects a sense of trying to hold on to this romantic settler colonial sense of the world and sense of nature. And in many ways that reflects their own anxiety over this changing world. Moving on now to stage 2 of pain and anxiety. Once the sort of initial shock and denial phase passes, many youth are experiencing anxiety. And this was shown in this quote from Manjot Kaur, who's a student at the University of Sydney. And she says, "People were going to school and just living their lives. I was thinking, how could I just go to my class normally when my future is so uncertain and there's a massive crisis going on?" Now, climate distress or eco-anxiety, there are many terms that are coming out because there's only emerging research happening right now on this topic. But as talked about, it's a pre-traumatic stress disorder related to the threat of a global eco-crisis or a sense of impending doom or eco-apocalypse upon us. We've seen this in a number of polls, such as in America 2019, where 57% of teenagers said they feel scared about climate change, or 52% they felt angry, and while only 29% of these teens said they felt optimistic about their future. This is even more stark in Australia in the same year, where 82% of youth agreed with the statement that climate change is going to diminish my quality of life in the future, showing that there is a real sense of despair in really investing in one's future with these kinds of sentiments and with this kind of anxiety. And in fact, one of the first cases of eco-anxiety, climate distress, was in Australia with a 17-year-old boy that was hospitalized from severe dehydration after refusing to drink water during a national drought in Australia. Now, again, once the shock and denial phase has passed, and once even the eco-anxiety has sort of subsided, or it maybe it even translates now into a new psychological phenomenon, emotional experience, which is now anger and bargaining. And this kind of anger is really best reflected in Greta Thunberg's statement at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York City in 2019. "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm the lucky one. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We're in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" Now, Greta's words and her actions in terms of being a solo climate striker in August 2018, as we well know, helped spark a global widespread movement with youth, with now over 7 million youth in September 2019 doing climate strikes around the world. We also know, as I've expressed in my previous presentation, that there was absolutely a foundation for the youth climate movement, that it existed before, but it was able to help then be the support system that helped spark and foster the global rise for Fridays for Future. And we see that in groups such as 350.org and others that are very much youth-led climate organizations that have been around since 2016. But what makes this different is for sure the digital nativity of Gen Z that did help spread it even more like wildfire. Also that there was this sense of deep anger and betrayal from the adults because they've literally had an entire lifetime now of broken promises. From the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro to Copenhagen Climate Summit that I described before, to the Paris Agreement. It's been broken promise after broken promise of climate agreements and environmental agreements. However, one of the limitations of this movement is the fact that it is still in this kind of bargaining realm, where it is often asking the same oppressive power structures and power holders that are creating the problem in the first place for them to change the world. And in many ways, it's sort of reifying and legitimizing their power versus deauthorizing and delegitimizing their power and creating a new power, something I'll speak to a little bit more later. Moving on now to the fourth stage. This is now a stage around a deeper level of depression, withdrawal, but also a deeper sense of reflection and critical thinking about one's cause and even one's role in that cause and how they're relating to the climate crisis overall. Now, this can play out as Jamie Margolin talks about in her experience of burnout. She says, "I got so burnt out and fed up with everything, I wanted to crawl into a hole and never do anything again. I sacrificed too much of my personal life and happiness, so much so that I started resenting the cause." So I talk about activist burnout because I think there's a real correlation even with right now what's going on with COVID-19 and the global health pandemic. Because first off, what is activist burnout? Well, it usually happens after a period of time dedicated to a cause and kind of a sense of martyrdom, as activists can fall into depression, hopelessness, and despair, and even depart from the cause entirely. It's actually very common. One study in 2003 found that 10 to 50% of union and peace activists of prior movements have experienced burnout, and up to 87% of peace activists had quit activism within 6 years of getting involved. So that's particularly interesting in terms of the light of COVID-19, and sort of one could say there's a global collective depression and global collective deep reflection happening right now. But we see this play out in terms of the youth climate movement, where there's been a significant drop in youth participation during this pandemic, from 7 million in September 2019 to as few as a few thousand in this last March virtual strike by some estimates. So is this a period of kind of deep depression and fallout, or is this a period of deep critical thinking, or both? The people that have stayed in this movement, the youth climate activists, have continued to participate in weekly webinars and trainings and conversations and virtual strikes. And this has really been a platform for more deep critical learning and reflection as a movement as a whole, but as young people, because they're connecting now much more so than they ever did before with Global South and Global North participants as a whole. And it's really heightening the conversations about what climate justice really looks like. Finally, the last stage is reconstruction and resilience. Now, I didn't use the normal stage of the Kubler-Ross model of acceptance stage because I would argue that that's essentially nihilism in the face of climate change, as well as it's just succumbing to oppressive power that's created the problem in the first place. So instead, looking to what the youth conversations are, I've really seen a space of reconstruction and resilience. And particularly learning from the lessons in the most impacted and marginalized communities, and particularly from BIPOC youth. And so here is a quote from Dakota Iron Eyes of the Standing Rock movement around reconstruction. "I grew up knowing that nature was my relative and everything was part of me. People only care for something they feel affects them. But if you learn how we are all connected with nature and each other, one person's suffering is our collective suffering. It's not the earth's suffering, it's all of our suffering." So I think that there's a lot of lessons here in terms of where the youth climate movement is moving into this deeper space of climate justice. because as Black feminists would describe it, and many critical social theorists would describe it, that the most oppressed people have the most to teach others about anti-oppression and about systemic change. And so in this example, BIPOC youth and youth from the most impacted, marginalized communities facing the brunt of the climate crisis have the most to teach us in terms of how we adapt, how we resolve, how we seek solutions, alternatives, on where to go next. And so I really turn now to MAPA, which is a term about the most affected people and areas, because 85% of children and youth live in low and middle income countries, LMICs, where it is predicted that the most serious impacts of climate change will occur and are occurring currently. For this is not a future distant scenario. This is a lived reality and struggle for many impacted marginalized communities and many BIPOC youth right now. And so there's been a real connection around connecting the dots by many BIPOC youth around climate change, Black Lives Matter, and Indigenous sovereignty in terms of the same systems of oppression for people are the same systems of oppression to the earth. And that, particularly coming from a critical environmental justice lens, not looking at multiple levels of oppression, but also looking at the ways in which we start to delegitimize and deauthorize oppressive power. And we don't just reconstitute it, but we reconstruct a new power, our people's own sense of themselves, their own identities, their communities, and their place in the world, as well as a sense of reconstructing communities, cities, and the world at large in an alternative space and where we're going. And so there's many exciting and inspiring stories of reconstructing power and where a new world might look like. And so some examples here I point out that are both involving youth, some even youth-led, but yes, some are also adult-led. But in terms of Indigenous-led clean energy projects here in Canada, there are over 300. And this is really about energy sovereignty and getting away from a colonial power grid, but also colonial power, literally and metaphorically, and really having that independence. And that's part of reconstructing new power metaphorically and literally, but also in terms of food sovereignty. So this is a Black food co-op in Baltimore, and it's teaching youth on how to have their own sense of skills and knowledge around food sovereignty. This is doubly, triply important in a time of COVID, where a lot of Black communities were not able to have the same resources to fill up on food stocks for several months as many white privileged communities were. And so this becomes really important, again, about sovereignty and creating the spaces and futures which we need to go in, because we know that also food systems will be facing struggle in a climate warming world. So lastly, and I'll end soon, is just to say that if we are going to be able to meet this massive decarbonization agenda of 50% cuts within this decade, that those that have the most at stake and the most to lose need to be the architects of those new plans in terms of the adaptation and resilience plans towards smart cities, smart infrastructure, housing, transportation, food systems, you name it. And so we have much to learn from impacted and marginalized communities, much to learn from BIPOC youth if we're going to truly adapt and build resilience towards this warming world and towards a decarbonization agenda. Now, my conclusions here, just to end, is that I would argue many adults are stuck in stage one of climate denialism, as poll after poll after poll shows us that there is this generational divide of higher skepticism in boomers and Gen Xers than there is with millennials and Gen Z. We also know that young people have experienced more breadth and depth of other these stages, as it does directly impact their lives and directly impacts their futures, and they're having to face it head on now. And so we have much to learn, and young people have much to teach us on dealing with climate grief. Now, of course, this is artificial categorization of these 5 stages of climate grief, and not all youth experiences fit into these stages or this linear progression, or they may experience other kinds of stages, or they may stay in a particular stage and not necessarily move to other stages. But each stage does have something to teach us, particularly reconstruction and resilience, as adapting to a warming world and learning from those most impacted by climate change in developing a resilient community, city, and worldview. But ultimately, we need to really move the climate change response past paternalistic approaches. What I mean by that is how we have science, politics, and media culture telling youth and even the global south and impacted marginalized communities on how to live and how to respond to this crisis. Instead, we need to be having a dialogical approach, such as Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and learning from the emotional intelligence of youth in grappling and adapting to this warming world. And I want to end here with Elizabeth Kubler-Rose, and she says, the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. And so in a rapidly changing and warming world, we are experiencing loss, and we will never be the same. And like the pandemic has shown us, normal was a crisis. And so we have much to learn from youth who are already facing this crisis head on and who are already showing resolve and adapting to a warming world. And that's why I like to always end on this metaphor. I always find that the caterpillar does reflect youth in a warming world. Just when the caterpillar thought the world was over, it became a butterfly. Now, if you'd like to check out more resources, I'm going to be uploading a expanded slide deck for additional resources on the 5 stages of grief here, as well as my bibliography if you want to do some additional readings on this topic. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and see you at the next class. Goodbye.